Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited that you're all here, and thank you for taking your lunch hour to be with us so that we can all learn together about the future of forests. Many of you have visited with us before, and you've heard about our forest program. I think you're going to be very excited to learn about how it's iterated and grown over the years, and to really talk about what we're doing in the future. And as we approach this discussion, I would love to have you chat into us about what you're excited about in terms of how forests are being managed currently in California. And then conversely, what makes you sad or what is concerning to you? So it's good for us to hear from you and see how you're feeling so that we can answer your questions appropriately and follow up with you appropriately. So with that, I'm the Chief Development Officer here in California. My name is Liz Harvey Roberts, and I've been an employee for about 14 years now, so it's been quite a while. I love every minute of it, and I love everything about what the Nature Conservancy does, and I'm in general super excited by nature. I love our forests, of course, here in California. I'm a native Californian. I have grown up backpacking and skiing. So whether it's in the Trinity Mountains, the Marble Mountains, or Sierra, I've been a lot of places, and I'm happy to say that I've been able to see a lot more places through the Nature Conservancy. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Laura Crane to you. She's our featured speaker today, and she is the director of our climate program. And as you're listening to Laura, think about questions that you'd like to ask her. You have the opportunity to do that in the Q&A function on the right-hand side. So we'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, Laura.
Thank you so much, Liz. Really appreciate that. I'm also a native Californian and grew up going to the forest pretty much every summer. So I love the forest. My name is Laura Crane. I'm the director of the Nature Conservancy's California Climate Program. And since we're here to talk about forests and climate, I just want to acknowledge the scary and very relevant headlines that we've been seeing recently, including the Canadian wildfires burning out of control and the impact that that's had on air quality across the Northeast and central part of this country. And July 3rd, marking Earth's hottest day on record. These global headlines are a warning of future extremes. And here in California, we are very familiar with extremes. I'd say we've been living extremes. Wildfires, smoke, and blackouts, this whiplash between drought and then flooding, sea level rise resulting in storm surge, and excessive heat. The climate crisis is right here, close to home, wherever home might be. It seems that the past couple of years, society has finally woken up to the very real threat that global warming poses to people and to nature. And there's growing determination to do something about it. And yet, climate change is a global issue, and there is no one silver bullet that will be the solution. I'd argue that we are already climate changed. And our goal now is to do everything we can to avoid the worst impacts that climate change could bring, and to invest in making our communities and nature more resilient to these extreme events. We need an all hands on deck, multiple pronged approach to create a future where nature and humans can thrive. And as the world's 5th largest economy, California is critically important in demonstrating how society can move in the right direction. What we do here in California matters. So it's instructive to look at the approach that California is using to fight climate change. And it's also helpful for illustrating the unique role that the Nature Conservancy plays in climate. The first thing that California needs to do is dramatically cut greenhouse gas emissions. So let's talk about the emitters first. You can see that there are many sources of greenhouse gas emissions that the state of California is working to cut. We at the Nature Conservancy do not focus on all of them. We focus where we can bring our expertise to make the biggest difference. And that is where there's a nexus with nature. And you can see here that destroying nature and mismanaging natural habitats are two sources of emissions. So the Nature Conservancy is working to ensure that natural and working lands are protected and not converted, which keeps carbon in the vegetation and soils instead of releasing it into our atmosphere. We also work on managing natural ecosystems and working lands in ways to reduce the carbon that these ecosystems are putting into the air, such as from megafires in our forests, which we'll be talking about today. The second thing that California needs to do is pull carbon out of the atmosphere or increase the carbon sinks. We need allies in the fight to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And while there are some emerging technologies to do this, nature is the most cost-effective solution, and it's proven itself over millions of years to be our best ally in this fight. And while all of the approaches that you see on the slide are needed, nature is the only climate solution that not only helps with climate mitigation, and that's what we're looking at here, reducing greenhouse gas emissions through reducing the sources and increasing the sinks. It's the only climate solution that also helps people and wildlife and plants adapt to the change and changing climate future. So, for example, healthy forests reduce the risk of megafires. Protected floodplains slow floodwaters and attenuate those waters so that communities are less impacted and groundwater is replenished. And it turns out that considering nature and how we plan for that climate change and changing future is smart in other ways too. For example, in decarbonizing our energy sector. Building renewable energy has a huge footprint on the land. And it turns out that land use is a key barrier to our transition to clean energy. So by bringing the Nature Conservancy's expertise about where the important ecological areas are and where there are areas that could be developed with less impact, the Nature Conservancy has helped accelerate the development of clean energy while also making sure that the energy is what we call green because it's sited in environmentally low impact areas. So what you're looking at here is the focus of the Nature Conservancy's California Climate Program. Our California Climate Program's mission is to protect nature to combat climate change. We think of nature as the solution. So what does that mean? It means that we need to invest in protecting and restoring nature to ensure that our most effective ally in climate change mitigation does not weaken and become a carbon emitter instead of a sink. We are at a critical juncture, a tipping point in nature's ability to stay on the right side of the carbon scale. And nowhere is that more clear than in our forests, which have been compromised by development and management and megafires. Fires that burn so hot and so high that it destroys the forest's ability to regenerate. And you can see on the screen here that forests are on both sides of this equation, the emitters and the sinks. They are a particularly important part of our efforts to combat the impacts of climate change. Sometimes when people look at solutions for climate change, they think of nature as kind of a nice to have addition in the toolbox of solutions. They don't think of it as central to the climate problem and to the solutions. And yet, here is a telling fact. It took California 16 years to reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions by 65 million metric tons. This was achieved by California's leadership in decarbonizing its energy sector. Really hard-earned gains. And yet, just 1 year of wildfires in 2020 wiped out 16 years of reductions by emitting 127 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. That's almost twice the amount of all the emission reductions that we were able to achieve in over 16 years. So I'd say that nature is not just a nice to have. Nature is the solution, and we are not going to win the fight against climate change without nature. This is a critical moment. There are two futures ahead of us. One where we help our forests adapt to and thrive, and one where they aren't the ally that we need them to be. At the Nature Conservancy, we have exciting work underway to ensure that we bring about what we think is the right future, where our forests are our closest ally in the creation of a future where we mitigate climate change's impacts on our state and on our planet. We believe successful restoration of California's forests can serve as a model for other states, regions, and the world. So let's talk about forests. You may be wondering, how did we get here? How did our forests become such large emitters of carbon? This is very much a man-made problem. First, through forest management practices. Like most dry forests of the West, over the past century, forest managers in the Sierra rushed to extinguish all the fire and starved our forests of the benefits and regenerative impacts that fire provides to forests. And they inadvertently created a massive buildup of fuels that today has transformed fire from a natural, beneficial, and regenerative force in our forests, what we call good fire, into a significant threat for both people and for nature. Second, we've built many homes and communities in places that are destined to burn and can't be protected. And we've seen the resulting loss of life and property as our California fires have grown in their size and intensity. And third, by failing to curb carbon emissions, which created climate change and compound the risk and impacts by fueling global warming and all of the drought and heat and the forest health stress that comes along with that. So today's catastrophic wildfires burn much hotter, higher, and faster, feeding on the buildup of fuels on the forest floor from a mistaken belief that all fire is bad and the more trees in the forest, the better. Our forests in this state are a problem for climate, both from that mitigation perspective, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and from an adaptation perspective, how we live in this climate changed future. Megafires emit massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, and unhealthy forests cannot absorb as much carbon from the atmosphere. And so this is the really wicked problem that our forest strategy team has been leaning in to address. We found that there's a specific recipe for success in our forest work, and each part of this puzzle is critical to our work. First and foremost, our work to date showcases the importance and influence of the Nature Conservancy's collaborative science. Our science shows that our forests need ecological restoration. Ecological forest restoration is basically removing the small and unhealthy trees that have created the dense and dangerous conditions in our forests and applying prescribed fire to remove fuels from our forest floors. The combination of thinning and prescribed fire regenerates the forest and restores the ability for the forest to have natural, low to moderate severity fire cycle, which is necessary for keeping our forests healthy. We also invest in the science to figure out where to get the most return on forest restoration investment from a biodiversity conservation values perspective and from reduction of risk to people and property. Next, we prove out ways to increase the pace and scale of restoration by spearheading demonstrations on the ground, where we figure out how to do this work faster and at a bigger scale. From planning to permitting to implementation, we show that our approach works, and then we leverage that success into larger projects and bigger impact on the ground. Third, this work is complex and challenging, and partnership with other organizations is the only way to get it done. Some of the key partnerships for us include local communities, the U.S. Forest Service, tribes, and an array of land trusts and other organizations committed to this work. And finally, without effective policies at a state and ideally federal level that support scaling and funding forest restoration, we would not be able to get our work done. While private funding is critical, there is simply not enough of it to drive forest restoration at the scale and speed that climate change demands. And we know that this approach works. What you're looking at here is a picture of post-fire in Oregon that burned through the forest in various stages of restoration. You can see here that the fire burned very differently where there was no treatment versus where the ecological thinning had occurred versus where both thinning and prescribed fire had been applied. I mean, it's just striking. The Nature Conservancy in California is a leader in ecological forest restoration, and ecological forest restoration is the way to protect our forests, make them more healthy and resilient, and help our forests help us in the fight against climate change. By lowering tree density and removing excess forest fuels, when fire does happen, it's less intense, it burns fewer trees, and it actually helps regenerate the forests. So less emissions are created from wildfires, and what remains is a healthier forest to pull carbon from the atmosphere. It's this balanced system that has worked to perfection for millennia. To give you a sense of how we're scaling this work, I wanted to show you how we've approached this ecological restoration. We started our planning and implementing our on-the-ground restoration efforts near the Nature Conservancy's preserve at Independence Lake in a project of about 2,300 acres. This work has been completed, and we learned a lot about how to do the work better and faster for the next time around, from the permitting to the hiring of fire crews to thinning and removal of trees. This was a great example of that demonstration part of the process that I discussed earlier. Armed with the learnings from Independence Lake, we soon initiated our 28,000 French Meadows project with the Tahoe National Forest to demonstrate that rapidly restoring forest at scale was possible if partners were willing to engage in collaborative governance and planning, joint fundraising, and adaptive management. That work led to a similar approach across the North Yuba Forest, a 275,000 acre landscape. In order to reach this scale, we're standing up our own prescribed burn teams. We're working to help create a market for the small trees that need to be removed. And we're working with agencies like the Forest Service and CAL FIRE to build a workforce that's big enough to make a difference. Our next goal is even bigger. We developed a framework for prioritizing forest restoration projects across the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, a 2.4 million acre landscape in the Central Sierra Nevada. And the science that the Nature Conservancy developed to create that prioritization framework was really groundbreaking. We identified 10 factors to define what forest resilience meant and established a vision for achieving it. And that science has been so influential that the governor's task force has adopted the approach for California. And recently, California's Natural Resource Agency, which also adopted that prioritization framework, partnered with google.org to make a tool that's easy to use and freely available so that state programs and fire practitioners in California can use that prioritization framework. The resulting interface will go live this year and will help direct billions of dollars, not just across the Sierra Nevada, but potentially across more than 30 million acres, all of the forests in California. This is truly impressive and tangible scaling, and something that we and the team are quite proud of. And yet, despite all of the progress, the reality on the ground is sobering. So what you're looking at here is a chart that shows treatment areas versus burned areas. We made a lot of progress, a lot of areas got treated, and we increased public investment in thinning and prescribed fire. But you can see we are not keeping pace with megafires. Recent wildfires are burning a much larger area, and they're outpacing restoration treatments. In 2021 alone, almost 1 million acres burned in 2 fires, the Dixie and the Caldor fires. This is equivalent to 3 times the size of San Francisco. And what this tells me is that we need to look maybe at the problem differently. If we want to increase the pace and scale of getting our forests into that resilient state, maybe instead of focusing all of our efforts on the overly dense forests where fire has not occurred for a long time, We should also be thinking about post-fire management. I want to acknowledge that this bar graph is scary, but I want to encourage you to stay here and we can explain why it's not all bad news and actually reveals some opportunities. Wildfires have exponentially exceeded the treatment area in the last couple of years. But what this graph doesn't show is how those fires burned. When I see a line like that of the wildfires and the area burned, I imagine total devastation, kind of matchstick trees on blackened ground. But the reality is much more nuanced. Some of those fires burned at low severity and moderate severity, the kind of fire that regenerates the forests. And it's now up to us to find ways to leverage the work that the fires have already done where it was beneficial to get us on a track to get to resilience faster. So let's look at an example on the ground. For scale, here again is our North Yuba project area, the largest ongoing restoration area at 275,000 acres. And this is the area that burned in recent fires in the area. The footprint dwarfs the North Yuba project area. But this is a detailed view of how those fires burned. The red area represents areas of high severity fire, where the majority of trees were killed. But the green and the yellow, those areas, you're seeing area where the fire cycle functioned much the way it did before our forests were overgrown, the way it's supposed to. So there's a couple stories playing out here, and they both represent new frontiers for our forest work. In the green to yellow areas, the work is about using our science to ensure that the things forest managers do following a fire improves the health of the forest and its resilience. In the red areas that were severely damaged, it's up to us to take a strategic action to ensure that we don't simply regrow the same problem. It's time for us to think about restoration and preparation for next wildfires. So this is an example of what the forest might look like after a high severity fire, the red areas on the map that you just saw. The status quo in post-fire management of this area has been to salvage logs, which remove habitat for native species, and densely plant the same species of tree, almost like a crop. I mean, it's referred to as pines and limes. And then when the trees grow, and need thinning, there's often no follow-up treatment to reduce the density. So with this approach, we're planting what will be unhealthy forest and perpetuating this cycle of megafires. So the status quo needs to change. There are better approaches to post-fire management that now the Nature Conservancy is starting to think about bringing science to and working to test. The first, strategically replanted in places that burned at high severity. We need to plant in places where climate change does not limit regrowth. So there's some areas of the forest where climate change makes it very hard to regrow, but there are other areas where the forest will regrow. And when we do plant, we should plant using a gap and clump pattern and a diversity of tree species. Second, we can reburn areas that recently burned at low to moderate severity within 15 to 20 years, which is that natural cycle that the forest needs. And we recognize that this strategy could be uncomfortable for many to have fire come in again to an area that was recently burned, but it is vital to getting our forests back on a healthy cycle. And finally, burned areas can help us manage future wildfires because burned areas actually change the dynamics of wildfires, stopping it or reducing the severity, like you saw in that previous slide. An example of this would be letting fires burn into the current burn scars. Once we create the enabling conditions to let fires burn the way nature intends, we need to let the wildfires burn naturally at the right severity. The challenges that we have in front of us are formidable, both for forest health and related to climate change. And as you've heard, forests are our most efficient carbon sinks, our allies, but can quickly become carbon emitters. And not just carbon emitters, but they can wipe out more than a decade of emissions reductions in a single fire season. So forests are it if we want to address climate change. And that's why the work that our forest team is doing gives me optimism despite the challenges. I've seen firsthand how our team cannot only identify, but also pull the most important levers to create enabling conditions for our work, and that kind of scaling that I talked about earlier. And I've seen how that can completely change the landscape on the ground and the political landscape. And I've seen how our teams can identify and dismantle key barriers to restoration. And finally, I've seen how solutions that provide tangible benefits to people and nature spread. I thought about using the phrase spread like wildfire. And in the context of this presentation, it seems like a fitting ending analogy. We are working to have solutions spread like megafires and have wildfires in California forests spread like low severity wildfires. That just rolls off the tongue. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. And we're gonna move on to questions. And I'm really pleased to say that we have on the webinar, the lead scientist for our forest strategy. And I think we have the lead of our forest strategy on as well. Kristen Wilson is the lead forest scientist, and Dan Porter is the forest strategy lead. And so they'll be joining me for answering questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. We are so lucky to have you, and I really enjoyed the articulation of our repositioning and the next iteration of our forest strategy. Thank you so much for all of the questions that have come in, and I just want to remind you that you can still add questions because we're going to be using this in our question and answer portion, and we've got these great experts, Kristen and Dan, with us too. So without further ado, Scott asked the question, what does proper forest management look like, and how does it vary from one forest or region to the next? Because we've talked about forests in general, but maybe give us a little bit of context around how it might vary in different regions and types of forests.
That's a really insightful question because it does vary, and I'm going to turn it to Dan to answer this one.
Thanks, Laura. Just doing a sound check. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah, great question. One of the main ways we think about applying the most appropriate treatment to a particular forest is based on that forest fire history. And what I mean by that is how frequently it burned prior to European settlement, with a combination of natural lightning strikes and of course cultural fire. And what we find when we look into that deep record is that you're absolutely right. In fact, the forests vary quite a bit. The Sierra mixed conifer forest that we work in, primarily on the west side of the Sierra Nevada, tended to burn every 7 to 12 to 15 years pre-settlement. But if you just go up on the slope a little bit to a red fir forest, those forests were cooler and wetter, and they tended to burn less frequently and maybe a bit more severely over time. So the short answer is we do our homework and we look at the deep history of our forests, and then we tailor our prescriptions accordingly.
Thank you. And then a follow-up question that Scott asked and Robert asked, what about how we're harvesting timber from our forests right now? Is it enough, doing it in a sustainable way, is it enough to meet the demand? How are we thinking about the timber industry moving forward?
You want me to take this one as well? Yeah. Yeah, great question. And boy, a big topic, but the short story is that California, as a state, is one of the largest importers of wood products. We actually import somewhere between 50 and 60% of the wood that we use in the state. And a lot of that comes from Oregon, Washington, and Canada, among other places. So the idea of sustainable wood production for the sake of provisioning building materials, it quickly becomes a global markets issue. What I can say is that our team is working on with business professionals and experts to try to figure out how we can use the really small trees that are the hazardous fuels, the surface and ladder fuels, to produce value-added products like mass timber and cross-laminated timber, which are more sustainable, more durable wood products, and have what's called an embodied carbon. In other words, the carbon stored not only in the tree, but also in the building for many years after the building is built. So that's a relatively new technology. It's pioneered in Europe, and we're trying to really get it off the ground in California as well.
Thank you. So Nora has asked about the government's reliance on unproven technologies like carbon capture and direct air capture. She says nature is the best resource for carbon sequestration, but seems like the government's more focused on tech solutions. And so how can we get the government to shift its focus to natural sequestration? So I would love, I know we've alluded to them as partners. Of course, the state and federal governments own a lot of our forests, so they are natural partners. But yeah, tell us what's going on with the government and how we are interacting with them, and what are they proactively doing on behalf of our forests?
Yeah, well, let me start off at a high level and just say that the Nature Conservancy has been really instrumental in getting this idea accepted and incorporated into climate action plans, that nature-based solutions are an important piece of the climate solution. In fact, it was the Nature Conservancy science that showed that globally, nature could account for about a third of the greenhouse gas emission reductions that we need. So we've been tremendously successful at raising the visibility of these solutions and actually getting them in policy here in California and globally, and in action plans. One of the things that we think is necessary is to actually demonstrate that you can deploy these solutions at scale. And so that's why we've been so focused on the scaling mechanisms for this work, because for the technology, it's kind of, you can imagine how you could think about deploying that technology at greater and greater scale, even though it's unproven. Nature is such a proven solution, and yet there are obstacles to getting that work to scale. And that's one of the key focuses of the climate program in California and the Nature Conservancy more broadly, is how do we remove those obstacles so that we can deploy these nature-based solutions. I think that the forest work here in California is a great story of how we've worked with the government to actually prioritize it and to fund it. And I wonder, Dan, if you want to talk just a little bit about the campaign that we've done and the funding successes that we've had to drive investment in forests in California.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Laura. So back in about 2018, 2019, after some of the largest wildfires, megafires hit California, our government affairs, our policy folks, our forest team, and our marketing colleagues all got together because we recognized that with an event that large, we, for better or worse, had the public's attention with respect to wildfires. And we thought maybe there's an opportunity to create even broader awareness and even some action around ecologically based forest restoration. So we put together this campaign with the tagline, "Let's stop making history." And the reference was, let's stop making the wrong kind of history, setting the wrong records, the most destructive, most deadly wildfires, and instead offer a different solution. And we pushed that message to lawmakers throughout Sacramento ahead of the budget cycle, and contributed to the passage of $1 billion wildfire and forest resilience package, which was the first of its kind and the largest of its kind. That was $1 billion over 5 years. Currently, we're at about $600 million a year in state funding and roughly 7.5 billion nationally for the USDA Forest Service.
Thank you so much. We have a question from an anonymous person who is a forest geneticist. So I think this is a Kristen Wilson question. So I'm a forest geneticist by training, and I would love to understand how forests can be carbon sinks. My concerns are that the carbon is held for a growth period and then released massively through fires or through rotting. It seems to be a cycle, not a sink. Please help us understand this.
All right, I'll do my best here. Thanks for that question. Yeah, you're spot on that when a fire burns and when trees rot, you're losing that above ground carbon storage that's in the trees. And like Laura mentioned, during the big wildfires, there were a lot of emissions from those wildfires. I think what can happen is by decreasing the fire severity, so by treating the forest, by thinning and burning it ahead of time, so that when a wildfire does hit, you're not losing all of those trees. You could potentially, basically ensure that the carbon that is there isn't lost. So forests will regrow following a disturbance, but there's a lot of uncertainty right now around how long it's going to take in areas that are burning at high severity fire. And so you can imagine forests, they store carbon, but they kind of lose it in fires and then regrow it. So they have this above ground carbon store as well as the below ground carbon store. And that above ground store is fluctuating, and with climate change and increased wildfire, there's a projection that it's going to decrease. So I think our thought is really, if we can do thinning and prescribed burning in such a way that it reduces the wildfire severity, that we can extend that carbon that's in the above ground biomass a little bit longer, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Kristen. All right, so Charles has asked, are we doing work in the oak woodlands? Is TNC involved in demonstration efforts in oak woodlands and related to fire?
I'll go ahead and jump in on this one. Thanks for that question. Oak woodlands are a really important ecosystem in California. We have so much of them. They're incredibly biodiverse. And for those of you who don't know already, we have a bit of a regeneration problem among our oaks. We don't have enough young oaks coming online to replace the really old, magnificent ones that we see when driving by. The short answer is we don't have a fully built out program for that, but what we are doing is, I think Laura mentioned this, accelerating the training of prescribed fire professionals in California. And that work can occur in really any ecosystem that is fire adapted. So very recently, our brand new fire manager, Sarah Gibson, worked with CAL FIRE in and around a oak woodland setting to do a training burn and recover some of the grasses and oak woodland habitats there. So, and I think similar opportunities exist down at Dangerman Preserve.
I'll just add that we don't have anyone on the webinar from the team that manages all of the Nature Conservancy's preserves, but similar to how I talked about, it really started with our management at one of our preserves, Independence Lake, our forest restoration work, that we have preserves and oak woodlands where we're working to figure out how to best manage before fire and post fire.
Thank you so much. There have been a number of comments, positive comments about working with Indigenous communities and cultural knowledge. So maybe could you say a little bit more about how we're working with various tribes in various areas?
Yeah, I'm really excited to answer this question because I just came back from a meeting in Portland where we were talking about our work with Indigenous partners. So in California, TNC as a whole, meaning mostly our North America fire team, has been working with the tribes up in the Klamath, Siskiyou area, the Karuk tribe, Yurok tribe, Hoopa tribes on prescribed fire trainings for, I think, over 10 years at this point. And the meeting I was at was also attended by a wonderful woman who I met for the first time in person, Elizabeth Azuz, who's a Karuk tribal member, and she heads up the indigenous prescribed fire training program up there, and was just so generous and thoughtful in her comments about the Nature Conservancy's partnership with the tribe over those 10 years, because both of our organizations have learned so much, and her program as a result, partially of our help, has grown quite rapidly, and she's very appreciative of that. In turn, we are extremely appreciative to learn the nuances of millennia worth of knowledge and practices that would be completely unattainable were it not for that kind of partnership. So we're very excited about that work. We're expanding it to work with the Washoe tribe in and around the Sierra Nevada, Carson Valley area, and potentially many others.
Great. All right, so this was a question that was interesting to me and something I've thought about before. So how do wildlife behave in prescribed fires? And is there an attempt to get them to move in front of the fire? Or are there any special things that you do on behalf of wildlife when you are applying fire?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first preventative thing that we do is identify the sensitive habitats that are in the burn unit and afford those habitats special protection. So an example of that might be a really, really large sugar pine that has a complex branch architecture, and we might scratch a line around it so that the fire doesn't kill that particular tree because it's a good nest tree. Similarly, we'll try to really moderate the fire behavior in a riparian area, creek area. Other than that, we tend to rely on the fact that wildlife move. They do move quite quickly and effectively, and the type of fire that we're applying is very slow. And so there's, generally, from what I've seen, plenty of time for them to move out of the way.
Great. That's very hopeful for me. Okay, so Phil is asking about different planting designs. So maybe Kristen, maybe you know about this. So if we don't want to do pines and lines, and we want to do clumping, are there different types of designs that we're looking at or that researchers are looking into? And just give us a little more color on that.
Sure. Yeah, this is a new area that we're starting to go into right now. And I'd say the Forest Service researchers as well are starting to push on this topic. And there's efforts to essentially be more diverse in the planting scheme. So not only in terms of the pattern of openings and then clumps of trees where there's wetter conditions. So looking at position on the slope, on the ridge versus close to a stream, and north versus south facing slopes, as well as what species to plant, and taking into account where you're at in terms of elevation. And all of this is leading to a lot of need for experiments to basically understand what happens with this regeneration and these plantings. Like, are they successful? What are the implications in terms of fuels and wildfire, and as well as habitat? So I think the spatial arrangement, there's going to be a lot of science happening on this topic in terms of what's effective for different objectives, and then also in terms of composition too. So more to come, just to say that I think we have, basically a template from trying to build off of what patterns wildfire creates, and you sort of can start there and think about conditions that fire creates, and then try and mimic that with your planting a little bit, with the idea that we're trying to shift towards more fire tolerant and drought tolerant species.
Great. Okay. Let's see. There's another question about not oak woodlands, but chaparral and coastal sage shrubs. What is the fire policy there? Are we using preventative fire there, or are we just letting fire burn? And I think part of this question is also probably embedded. That's where a lot of people live. So, how are we using fire where people live?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we know the chaparral systems are very different than like the conifer forests. Most of our focus has really been on how do we keep people out of harm's way and keep those habitats intact. We know that when people move into areas, that's not just fragmenting the habitat and putting people in harm's way. It actually brings in more ignition sources, right? So it brings in more fires, and the chaparral systems don't respond the same way as these conifer forests. So we're not working on prescribed fires. I don't know if there's anything, Kristen or Dan, that you want to add to that answer.
I mean, that's I think the only thing I would add is that in Southern California, in some of those shrub ecosystems, they have actually experienced too much fire in recent years, and that can lead to the conversion of a more natural habitat type to one that's a little simpler, and can also perpetuate non-native grass species, which then sets up a cycle of even more fire. So, California is a big state. It's very diverse. We as Laura said, intentionally focused on what we call fuel-driven fires, which are the wildfires that we know management can help with, and those are the conifer forests.
Thank you. And our good friend Rich asked about what are the methodologies to measure the emission of carbon from various types of land conversion?
What are the methodologies?
Yeah.
I can speak a little bit to that from Dick Cameron, who is our former climate scientist. There's methodologies to look at what you're going from and what you're going to. So, for example, if you're going from a wetland where you have sort of high carbon storage potentially to a development, and how much development are you actually doing, then you can sort of apply rates of reduction in carbon storage. Same thing if you're going from like a forest or a grassland, what are you going to? And then you sort of take that information on starting condition and ending condition in terms of how much development, and you can apply different reductions of carbon to account for that conversion of land use.
Okay. Rich, we can get back to you with more information too, if you so desire. And I just want to note that a number of people are putting things in the webinar chat. So I hope that, everyone that is with us can look at the chat, because there's some good information and resources that people are sharing there. This is another anonymous, well, let me go to the one before this. Jeff asked, and because other people have asked about this too, what are some of the impediments to good forest management, especially looking back in the past? Laura, you implied that there were a number of different impediments, but what are they, and therefore how can we get rid of them, overcome them?
Dan, I think you've been thinking about this for so long. I think you should take this one.
Okay, thanks, Laura. For a long time, can you guys hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Still? Okay, just checking. For a long time, the biggest impediment was lack of funding. And that's not a barrier that we've completely eliminated, because while the current public funding environment has been quite good, it's by no means guaranteed. And we know that this is going to be a long-term effort that will require sustained funding over probably 10 plus years. And so we're working on that front to create an outside of government campaign to really create a voice for sustained funding for wildfire mitigation. So that's an exciting new bit of work. I think the barriers that we're working on most proximately is on the implementation side of things, which is really accelerating workforce development. And so the barriers, lack of workforce, and the lack of what we call wood processing infrastructure. And the basic idea here is that the status quo is that the small trees that we're thinning currently are piled in piles and burned in the winter. All the emissions go up into the atmosphere, which is not ideal, and there's no value that is derived from those. There are ways to actually do that differently and move those small trees into not a super valuable product, but valuable enough to offset some of the restoration costs. And in doing so, every public dollar that's invested in forest restoration can stretch further. And so we're investing heavily in trying to accelerate those technologies in California.
Thank you. I think, redwood forest, that's the next question. So we've talked a lot about the Sierra forests, conifers, but what about redwood forests? How are they being managed right now? How do we feel about that? And then how do you work with smaller landowners? Because a lot of those parcels are smaller. How do you try to implement something with all the privately held forests that are on small parcels?
Yeah, that is a long-standing challenge because those small landowners are so numerous and don't have like a single strong lobbyist essentially in Sacramento to represent the diversity of their needs. But I will say that there are at least two things happening in the Redwood region right now that are pretty exciting. One is that there's a new movement that was borrowed and modified from the Midwest to California called the Prescribed Burn Association movement. And what this is essentially is from the Midwest, there were farmers, neighbors, ranchers who would get together and burn off their agricultural fields together, pool their resources to do that. Well, that model has migrated to California in these highly fragmented ownership patterns and turned into a kind of a redwood burning workforce that's very local. And so they do very small scale burning with local workforce. So that's really exciting. I think the other piece in the redwoods that has gotten more and more traction that really gives me enthusiasm is just recognition that they are literally one of the most effective terrestrial carbon sinks on the planet. So the carbon densities and values in redwood forests are equivalent and in some cases greater than those found in the Amazon rainforest. And so, and they continue to grow. There's this myth that is fortunately being expunged now that old growth forests tend to flatten out and get decadent and stop growing. That's actually not true. The science has proven that they keep growing and they put on massive amounts of carbons for centuries and centuries. So the more that that's recognized, the more I think management policies will move towards late seral old growth forest management.
Mm-hmm. So this is the last question. I know we're getting up to the hour. And thank you for the additional questions that people have contributed. What is it? We've had several questions that are kind of like, what is our perfect world, given the reality that we live in, where people do live in nature and things like that? What does a balanced forest look like? And Stephen specifically is saying, how does the strategy for resilience play out with the goal of carbon storage in forests, more trees with the goal to minimize fire impacts, thinning trees? So.
Yeah,
Is
it's
perfection?
a great question. And I'm going to turn it over to Kristen in a minute, because that prioritization framework that I talked about, that's been adopted by the governor's task force and the Natural Resources Agency, Kristen was really lead on developing it, and it defined resilience for really the first time using 10 different factors. And so you need to think about things differently if you're thinking about the forest that's adjacent to a community versus if you're thinking about a forest that is old growth and really like ecologically unique and important for biodiversity. And so I think that this framework for resiliency calls out these different factors and helps create management approaches based on that. And Kristen, maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about that framework that you work so hard to develop.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I think whoever, I can't remember who brought up the question, but you mentioned, increasing trees for carbon storage versus decreasing trees for, wildfire resilience. And I think that's a trade-off, right? And there's lots of different trade-offs that we can evaluate. And so the goal with coming up with these 10 pillars of resilience collaboratively with different science experts and stakeholders was really to understand, when people talk about resilience, it can be very confusing. Are they talking about the forest responding to a disturbance and maintaining the same structure and composition, like a very scientific definition of like a ball in a cup and sort of not tipping into some other forest type? Or are we talking about water? Are we talking about carbon? Are we talking about homes? And so I think our goal with framing resilience based on these 10 pillars, which are both ecological and social, was to encompass sort of a broader definition of resilience and then to come up with ways to measure it. So to actually quantify it using metrics. All of this was done in essence so that we can pull it together with decision support tools and then make our best judgments about where to do thinning and prescribed burning. And so this is really it's a way to take our best science and to try and shape where work is going to be done on the ground so that it's having the best impact of improving resilience across all of those pillars. That said, I think the other value of this Planscape tool that Google is finishing up, which builds off of the pillars of resilience and all the data, is that people can, if they just care about carbon, they can find the places where carbon could be, protected basically, or they can find the places where water benefits could be. So there's also the ability to tailor it if there's like specific focuses of different groups.
Wow, so interesting. Well, one of our guests was asking if we can share some of the links to papers and things. So we'll put together a list of resources that have been mentioned and send those out to you. So thank you so much for joining us. We rely on the generosity of all of you to give us fuel for our fire. And we really, really appreciate your interest and the value of your time in joining us. So with that, we are going to say goodbye, and we hope that you will join us for our next Future of webinar, which is going to focus on oceans. We hope that you stay cool today as the heat dome descends, and have a great remainder of your day. Thanks so much, Laura, Kristen, and Dan, for being our experts. Take care.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, everyone. Bye.